Hello, and thank you for taking the time to view this video of the Motivational Interviewing Treatment Integrity Code, or MITI. The MITI is a tool that answers two questions. The first is, how much is my clinical session like motivational interviewing? And the second is, what can I do specifically to improve my skills in motivational interviewing? My name is Scott Graham. I'm a business and personal coach and a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. I'll be your guide in this video. If you have any questions after the conclusion of this video, please feel free to email me or contact me via Facebook, LinkedIn, or motivationalinterview.biz. The purpose of this video is twofold. One, to orient you to the MITI, and two, to help you set goals to be more effective in motivational interviewing. Before delving into specific components of the MITI, I want to review the concept of target behavior as used in motivational interviewing. Recall that in motivational interviewing, we focus on facilitating change for a specific problem or issue. Your session is coded in reference to a specific problem or issue that you must identify when you submit your audio for coding. When you consider this, the purpose of it is clear. How can we help people change if we are not sure what we are helping them change toward or to? We must identify a target behavior to move toward. There are two components of the MITI: global scores and behavior counts. Global scores are meant to capture your interactions over an entire session. You are rated on a 1 through 5 scale, with 5 being the most congruent with motivational interviewing concepts, and 1 being the least congruent with motivational interviewing concepts. Global scores consist of 5 dimensions: 1. Evocation, 2. Collaboration, 3. Autonomy and support, 4. Direction, and 5. Empathy. The dimension for evocation focuses on how well you as the clinician communicate to the client that the reasons for changing mostly reside within them and how exactly that change should happen should come from them. Therefore, a clinician rating 5 on this scale proactively evokes reasons for change from the client and seeks answers from the client on how this change should happen. Conversely, a clinician who scores a 1 on this scale doesn't even ask the client why they need to change or how they need to change, but instead provides reasons for that change in complete absence of anything the client wants. The dimension of collaboration focuses on how well the clinician shares the power with the client. Therefore, a clinician who scores 5 on this scale actively encourages collaboration with the client in such a way that the client's ideas, beliefs, and values actively influence the session. Conversely, a score of 1 would indicate that collaboration is absent from the session and the counselor is assuming the role of expert. The dimension of autonomy and support is intended to measure how well the clinician communicates, supports, and actively fosters client perception of choice. Therefore, clinicians who score high on this scale are active in eliciting comments from the client that lead to a greater perception of choice on their part. Conversely, a clinician who scores 1 on this scale is rigid about change options and actively detracts from a client's perception of choice and control. The dimension of direction measures how well a clinician stays focused on a specific target behavior. A clinician who scores 5 on this scale actively focuses the session on specific target behaviors that are of concern to the client. Conversely, a clinician who scores 1 on this scale does not influence the topic or course of the session, and the discussion is left entirely in the hands of the client. The dimension of empathy measures the extent to which the clinician understands or makes an effort to understand the client's perspective and the client's feelings. A score of 5 on this scale is given when a clinician effectively communicates an understanding beyond what a client says in a session, actively attempting to put themselves in the client's shoes. Conversely, a clinician who has no interest in what's going on with the client, what their perspective is, and what their feelings are, gives little or no attention to a client's perspective, will score 1 on this scale. Behavior counts The second component of the MIGHTI differ from global scores in that coders simply tally the behaviors and do not assess the quality as they do with global scores. Just as there are 5 dimensions of global scores, there are 5 behaviors that coders are looking for. The first is giving information. Second, MI-adherent behaviors. 3, behaviors that do not adhere to motivational interviewing. 4, questions, closed versus open. And 5, reflections, simple and complex. Examples of behaviors that would be coded as giving information include education about a topic, explaining an idea or concept that is relevant to the intervention, giving a client personal feedback that is not readily available, and providing the client feedback from assessment instruments. Behaviors that are MI-adherent essentially exemplify dimensions of global scores. Examples of these types of behaviors include statements which emphasize the client's control, freedom of choice, and autonomy, supporting the client with statements of compassion or sympathy, and asking permission from the client before giving advice or information. You can correctly conclude that the behaviors that are not adherent to motivational interviewing fall out of line with the 5 global score dimensions outlined previously. Examples of non-adherent MI behavior include giving advice to clients without asking permission, confronting the client by blaming, shaming, correcting, ridiculing, moralizing, arguing, and directing the client by giving commands and orders. Closed and open questions are also tallied by the coder. Differentiating and tallying these 2 types of questions is critical by the coder because the more open-ended questions you ask and less closed questions you ask, the more likely your session will reflect motivational interviewing concepts and principles. The last behavior tract is reflections. Reflections consists of 2 types: simple reflections, which typically convey meaning of what a client has said, and complex reflections, which substantially add and expand to what the client has said. Just as tracking closed and open questions is important, tracking simple and complex reflections provides feedback to the clinician on how well their session reflects motivational interviewing concepts and principles. Now that you have a clearer understanding of what a MIGHTI coder looks for as they review your session, you are probably wondering what to make of all this data. There are 5 summary scores for you to consider. The first is the Global Spirit Rating. This is the average of evocation, collaboration, and autonomy global scores. The second is how many complex reflections you made as related to the total reflections you made during your session. The third is the total of open questions you asked during the session as related to the total number of questions you asked during the session. The fourth summary ratio compares the total reflections you made during the session to the total number of questions you asked during the session. And the final ratio compares the total behaviors that are considered MI-adherent to the total behaviors, both MI-adherent and MI-non-adherent, in the session. It is through these 5 summary scores, as well as the behaviors and dimensions that are tallied and assessed by the MIGHTI, that you, the clinician, can identify your skills and focus areas for ongoing development. I want to challenge you to set goals now, before you receive your initial MIGHTI report. This was important for me as a clinician because I wanted to know how well my perceived abilities correlated with my actual abilities. I want to challenge you to do the same. I suggest you first take a moment to assess your current abilities along each of the summary scores: Global Spirit, Complex Reflections Ratio, Open Questions Ratio, Reflection to Question Ratio, and MI-Adherent Ratio. Assess your current abilities and then add 10% for an initial goal. It might be easier to consider these ratios as percentages. Let's go through this briefly. Consider your Global Spirit Rating. Remember, that is the average of evocation, collaboration, and autonomy. Remember that these are scored on a 1 through 5 scale. What do you think your score would be on an initial session? Of course, it's tempting to put 5. It's tempting to say, oh, I'd be perfect in every single one of these categories. And unless you hold yourself out as motivational interviewing proficient, unless your treatment center has motivational interviewing listed as its core treatment modality, maybe you shouldn't put 100% perfect as your initial goal. Now consider your complex reflections. Of all the reflections you do during a session, what percentage would you consider to be competent and proficient? A clinician whose total complex reflections are only 10% of all the reflections they do? 40%? 50%? 60%? Identify what you think you will score and add 10% to that. Move on to open-ended questions. How many open-ended questions as a percentage of the total questions asked during a session would you consider proficient in motivational interviewing? 10%? 20%? 30%? Identify your percentage that you think you will score in your initial MIGHTI coding and add 10% to that. Now consider your reflection to question ratio. What in your mind would a competent motivational interviewer ask in terms of reflections and questions? Would there be twice as many reflections as questions? Twice as many questions as reflections? How do you think you will score, and set a goal based on this? Finally, consider MI adherent behaviors. Comparing MI adherent to non-adherent behaviors, we're looking at asking for permission before giving advice versus giving advice and offering solutions without asking permission. We are looking at emphasizing the client's control, freedom of choice, and autonomy versus confronting the client directly and blatantly. We're looking at supporting the client with statements of compassion and sympathy versus directing the client with commands and orders. As you think about how you are as a clinician, what percentage of your behaviors adhere to MI principles? Identify what you think your initial score will be and add 10%. Of course, for each of these summary ratios, the quote experts unquote have identified proficiency and competency scores, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. You can go look them up on the internet if you choose. I think you are your own best expert. Figure out where you're at, figure out where you want to go, and work for your personal best. Whether it's developing proficiency in motivational interviewing, being a financial savvy CFO, being a good father, being a good brother, being a good mother, being a good employee. Figure out what you want, what's important, where you want to go, and then go for it. If you have further questions about the MIGHTI, motivational interviewing training, or business and personal coaching, please give me a call at 866-245-2207 toll-free. I'd be happy to answer your questions and help in any way I can. Thanks for watching this video, and remember to follow your true azimuth.